So I am an MVP. I know there are many MVPs in the room, and I was advised that I have to be very careful with them. Just joking, come on. I am a 15-year MVP, so it's, oh my God, it's too much time. And I love coding. I mean, I get never tired, and I feel that this is probably one of the best times to be a developer right now. I love this stuff. I love playing and discovering new stuff. And it's amazing to see new technologies coming out. And I would get bored if things could last more than 1 year. I mean, it's terribly boring to work always on the same stuff. So I am literally amazed on the new technologies that are coming out, and I try to convince you as well that the new stuff is really great. So let's start from the developer box. When you want to approach the development with .NET Core on Linux, you have to think about which distribution do you want to adopt, which is the production distribution that you want to use, of course. And also to understand if you want, you can develop on the Linux itself. So maybe you want to use one of the many editors that are out there, or maybe you can use Visual Studio Code, which is very well appreciated from also non-Microsoft guys. So it's something that I can tell you, give it a try, because it's extremely powerful. It's very pluggable, so you can plug in many extensions. And among the various extensions, there are one for developing and debugging with C#. And of course, there are also other features that are interesting. So, for example, if you deal with native development, there are also the C++ tools available directly from the C++ team in Microsoft. And then there are, let's say, third parties, even if it's not fair saying third party, because Visual Studio Code is an open source product as well, and there are many people from the community contributing and giving their help with plugins. At the moment, Visual Studio Code does not run on ARM devices, so I cannot run Visual Studio Code here, but there are communities that recompiled Visual Studio Code for ARM and provided their own version. I didn't try it yet. I mean, it's amazing. And I cannot exclude that Microsoft will also provide this story in parallel. There are many things that are happening. And so my guess is yes, because the ARM, take this thing like my own opinion, is something that is going to happen more and more on the server side, okay? I imagine like servers with many ARM cards and all the processing happening there, even because we know that Intel has some little bugs inside their CPU, and this could help in isolating at the metal level the computing stuff. Then, of course, we can develop on Windows and then deploy on Linux. This is, at least for me, the most classical way of doing it. It's interesting because you can choose between Visual Studio Full, if you love being in a cockpit of your airplane, and you have thousands of menus and have many buttons. I love things with many buttons, and this is why I never tried to buy an iPhone, for example. Just a single button is not enough for me. It's something I want to push several buttons. I am still a kid. I mean, that does not make sense. For me, it's a personal taste. And one of the things that you can do, and I know if you are practical with this stuff, is that the Windows then can run Linux. Yes, so the Linux subsystem for Windows is something that allow you to run the full-fledged Ubuntu user mode on the Windows kernel. It means a monster, it's kind of Frankenstein, okay? And this means that it's not an emulation, it's not a virtual machine, it's a full-fledged subsystem. This means that basically every request that is done from user mode ring 3 to kernel mode ring 0 is redirected to the kernel Windows instead of the kernel of Linux. And this is a good thing because the performance are pretty much the same, okay? So this means that you have a real Linux machine under your fingers. The only thing that you can't do is when you access something that is driver dependent, because the kernel is different, and so if there is something that is machine dependent directly from the things that you install on Linux, of course you can't. So this is why I normally use a virtual machine, but you can use the Linux subsystem for Windows as well. From my point of view, Visual Studio full-fledged is the best choice because you have many buttons. And finally, one of the things that I also love very much, and we will talk about this in a moment, is developing inside a container. And we know that talking about container Linux is, of course, the primary choice because of the footprint is very small. By the way, we also have Windows container, and they are going on and on very well. But there are things like license costs that are not very well appreciated from everyone, and that must be considered, okay? And I cannot hide myself from recognizing Linux as being more advanced in this context. So why not using it now that we are all big brothers in the good sense? Which distribution do you want to use? There are many. The good part is that Microsoft was able to provide a single NetCore for all the distributions. So you don't need to have to download separate packages depending on the distribution you're targeting. And I was able to run, for example, CentOS, that is basically a Red Hat. And you can run Ubuntu. And by the way, the Raspbian that we have inside the Raspberry Pi is derived from the Ubuntu and Debian. And we have the OpenSUSE, for example, and Fedora. Okay? Recently, with the 2.1 that is currently in preview, we now have Alpine Linux. Alpine Linux is wonderful because I will show you a very lightweight container with a full-fledged ASP.NET Core application that runs inside it. So the good part is having really a very small footprint. So you basically have to choose the best one for your personal taste or the one that is closest to the production environment, of course. And then you can go on. Usually, you will find more literature with Debian derived, so Ubuntu and so on. And the prerequisites are there. I mean, there is not many things that must be installed. You know, the distribution are all different one from each other. And the first thing that you want to do is enable the SSH channel because, of course, you need to communicate with this machine, either the Windows itself when this is the Linux subsystem for Windows, okay? But also with the Raspberry Pi we have seen this morning, and of course also the virtual machine. So basically you have OpenSSH, which is probably the most well-known solution to have server-side SSH server, and then I use, as I said this morning, Bitwise, because in my opinion is the best client available at this time. If you want to develop on Linux directly, you need the SDK. And the SDK is already there on 2.0, NetCore 2.0, when you go to Linux x64. So basically the Intel architecture. And is coming, as I said this morning, on ARM as well. So they are working on that. There are previews. And as soon as the Net 2.1 will be out, there will be the SDK for ARM as well. So we are almost there. Otherwise, you just need the runtime if you want. Again, it's optional. Even the runtime is optional. Because you can create a deployment of the so-called self-contained deployment that we will see in a moment, where you publish all the files, including .NET Core itself. So the jitter, the debugging part, everything, every single piece. And you have everything in a single directory that you will copy on using SSH on your machine. Then you have just to chmod the executable attribute to the file, and then you are done, and you are free to go there. There is a slightly difference, since we are talking more about server scenarios. I want to underline this point that is extremely important, is that when you go in self-contained deployment, there is the issue that you have the responsibility to take the maintenance of the pieces of your application. So if there is a security issue, Microsoft cannot provide automatically the updates in order to fix the security issue. So it's up to you to redeploy the application as soon as the bulletin, the security bulletin is out. Maybe never, but if it happens, you have to, because it's extremely important. So you take the responsibility in this case. Instead, if you go with the runtime, it is installed like an apt-get, for example, okay? And you know that the people that is responsible for the maintenance of the system will have to apply the security patches, and they will also get the one for .NET that are provided directly from Microsoft. And they have this system of pushing automatically the next version only if it is a minor and it does not break any compatibility, so that you feel safe to install security upgrade without having to break your application. Of course, testing is always the best way to do it, but just in case. Then, if you want, you can install the Net tool, the network utility for Linux. And the LLDB debugger that we will see in a moment, that is the low-level stuff for taking the screwdriver and going directly in and seeing what's happening inside. Also because if you are deploying in the server application, and the application is probably headless, so without any user interface, you have to debug in production. Maybe I don't like to debug in production. Who loves that? But if you have a problem, but because you have to, what are you doing? Do we have the tools for doing that? How disruptive is, okay? So there are times in which you want to go there. And one of my advices is that if you go with a container, everything is simpler, because your environment is inside the box of the container. So it's a sandbox that it is very well isolated. You can reproduce exactly the things that are happening. And the chance that something happen only when you deploy on a certain machine are very, 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 very small. It may depend on the environment on the machine that is broken, for example. But it's extremely difficult. That depends on your application. So maybe debugging is not even something that should happen, okay? And the build essential are the classical package for building C++ related stuff. So, .NET Core 2.0. The executable that you can produce are console applications and ASP.NET Core application that are the two main, let's say, the environments that you may create. So the console is something that you create when you don't need to communicate with anyone, okay? And I love to describe ASP.NET Core as something that is exactly like a console application, but you just want to talk, okay? So you gain this HTTP server that is called Kestrel, that is embedded inside ASP.NET Core. And thanks to this server, you can talk HTTP, HTTPS, and the WebSocket. And this is a very good occasion to have a communication channel with someone, not necessarily internet or your customers or the web front end. Can be even an application that lives inside the system, okay? It can be an inter-process communication. Because nowadays, HTTP is a good protocol even for EPC. And I see many people requesting, why don't we use named pipes? Why don't we use this memory mapping stuff? And I feel like the 80s. I mean, it doesn't make sense anymore, okay? We have these channels that provide you an application protocol. And having an application protocol is extremely important from an architecture perspective. We cannot just rely on a few bits and say, oh, but I can write my own binary protocols that is more efficient. Come on. It's useless. If that is the problem of your application, it means that you have other problems, okay? The best chance to write an application that can run on multiple platforms and multiple architecture are libraries that are either written directly for .NET Core or, better, NetStandard. What is NetStandard? NetStandard is a new contract. It's a kind of, let's say, way to define how a library is done at the binary level, okay? When you have a NetStandard library, you know that you can access this library in a certain way. It's a kind of contract. The .NET team loves to make a parallel with the HTML contract. So it's the standard. When you have the HTML, you know that a browser speaks that language, okay? And then you have multiple implementations that are the browsers that everyone can understand HTML. In this sense, we have the NetStandard that is the pair with HTML and the browsers that are the various implementations existing on .NET. So .NET, the classic one, the .NET Framework, .NET Core, then there is the Xamarin, and so on. There are Mono and others, okay? And then you have the chance to also create native plugins. So native application. The Visual C++ team are providing really great tools from this point of view. They provide directly in Visual Studio the full edition, but also in Visual Studio Code, the templates to create application for Android, so for native Linux applications, and also libraries. So if you want to write an SO library for Linux, you can directly with Visual C++. And you also can switch the compiler in order to use Clang, for example. You can use also GCC from Visual C++. Another, I mean, heartbreaking. Okay? And this means that basically you can now leverage the power of packages, a concept that is not absolutely new, but you can create this kind of NuGet package that include what? A native library for Linux, a native library for Windows, and then your wrapper that is IL only, and P invokes either the first or the second, and is able to do the native things correctly, either on the Linux side or on the Windows side. And this is extremely important because on NuGet, you download just a single package. And you can use, regardless if your platform is Windows 86 or Windows x64 or Linux x64 or ARM on Linux. So it's extremely powerful, extremely interesting. Currently, the .NET Core 2.0 in ASP.NET Core do support TLS, that is SSL, just between me and you, but it's a word that we have to forget because it's different, okay? The TLS stuff, the HTTPS stuff, But it is not possible to configure via configuration files. So during the deployment, this can be a little weird. And so the reason was that there were problems during the first version with the configuration files. And they removed it because it was there. It was available. And I find many people asking for configuration files to write the name of the certificate, which, by the way, is a PFX normal standard format, so it's nothing special. And it was not possible to configure it this way. So I recreated a couple of classes and a way that is published to the URL that you can see there. So if you want to play with TLS and NetCore 2.0, just copy and paste the code that I wrote. It's extremely simple to put it on. But for your info, more or less the same solution will come with NetCore 2.1. So it's something that it was just a matter of time, and you will have it. By the way, you have the slides, so it doesn't matter to waste time in remembering this. You may have problems with the make cert, that is the standard way in Windows to create a self-signed certificate, at least in production, because make cert does not put the alias inside the certificate, something that is pretty new. And Google is now requiring the SAN field inside the certificate, the subject alternative name. And this field is mandatory for Chrome, otherwise it gets crazy. So in this case, ensure that you are using like OpenSSL or some other solution, or even better, an official published certificate on the internet before using that. So what can we do with ASP.NET cross-platform? The good part is that we have, and I want to bore you with this morning application that is, by the way, a full-fledged application in, yes, sorry, I take the other one. Okay, PyTerminal. Okay, so what we have now, this application, PyTerminal, is an application that is an application created with the template of ASP.NET Core and access a database that is SQLite. What does it have as special? Basically, nothing particular. The template creates different structure than in the past, so this is a new ASP.NET Core. And under www root, there is always that is needed from the front-end perspective, so all the files like CSS, JavaScript, and so on. I don't want to speak about that. And then there are configuration files that I created on purpose from the previous slide in order the TLS to work correctly. Okay, so these are basically my stuff. And there are other controllers. And you know, a good news is that the controller that are used as web APIs are basically the same, as you can see here. Controller is a base class of the one we use to access the UI. So the MVC stuff, sorry for this, okay. And you see that the base class is the same. So you basically have a controller base class, and you can derive it to either create an MVC standard controller or a web API controller to create simply a REST exchange with the external world. So here there are all the controllers. And then we have few things regarding the data. And this is basically the context from an entity framework ORM that is very simple, that deals with the SQLite database that is able to access the data and to provide the storage for this application. We then have migration in case the entity framework needs to upgrade the schema of the database, okay? We now have the models that are all the classes that are used to provide something significant here. I created also the DTOs when I exchange the data between two processes, okay, because I am using inter-process communication via HTTP. And also some services that are provided in the template to provide feedback to the user when it logins. What's happening here? Okay. And finally, a bunch of files that the most important is obviously the one that set up the application. And let's briefly see what is there. See, this is the startup application. This is the configuration. We have configure services. Okay. And you can see that we are adding all the services required to application like entity framework, SQLite, identity, and so on and so on. And we can go on and here until, as I showed this morning, the WebSocket middleware that is able to provide the communication there. So this is basically what is needed. Let's go a bit back and talk about the SQLite configuration. SQLite configuration is very easy. It's a kind of three-step work. So you can add the support to use SQLite. I commented out the line that was provided by the official template from Microsoft. So replacing the provider is extremely simple. Okay. Oops. Then the connection string is also very simple because SQLite is a single file. And the two lines of code that you have to type in order to provide the automatic generation of the database, because you don't have to create it manually or something like that. So everything looks very simple. And so we can go on and on. What is interesting now is to see how to provide a Docker solution that is one of my favorite. Is if you want to install on Linux or in Windows, you have these two solutions and it's great. But after that, you have the CLI that you have available here. And I want to show you very, very quickly the solution that I created with a brand new application, which is an application built with Angular 2, okay? So it's a full-fledged application where I created this Docker file that is a multi-stage. And instead of using the normal Ubuntu image, I am using the .NET Nightly SDK Alpine at the very first stage. So it's an SDK Alpine. Then after that, you will see the runtime Alpine. And finally, I run the application itself. What does it mean? That when I have this solution, plus, okay. You will have to see the Docker images. We have .basics, that is my image, but you will also have the two nightly that I used to build the container itself, okay? But basics 2 is fundamentally what I need. I call it basics just because it does nothing more that a template offers. So, and to run it, I created this small batch file that ran in production the application, and so I can now listen. Open localhost 5000. Since it is in production, it is not as verbose as this morning I shown on the Raspberry Pi. Otherwise, you will have every single statement, even on the database, you have every single query that is done. And you see we have a full-fledged application running inside how much? And the size is astonishing because we have 164 megs. So there is the whole node packages, the whole .NET stuff, everything. And I didn't even trim the packages that I needed to run the application. So I can even reduce this size by trimming down the packages that I don't really need. But fundamentally, there is a full-fledged application with ASP.NET Core. OK. So let's talk about debugging. Do you want before the good news or the bad news? The good one. OK. So basically, what we have, the idea is that I can go to this morning session, and even if you weren't there, it's not a problem. Because, I have to go to the other one, fit 2. OK. OK. I run the application. And many people tell me, why do you risk so much directly in your demos? Because people enjoy seeing the problems of the speakers, of course. That's why. So it's a kind of masochistic, you know. And I can make a debugger attached to process, OK? And I am trying to find my machine here. And I am so masochistic that I totally deleted all the configuration to show you what it's able to do. And I can go, yes, I can go to my machine and say PRAF6, that is the machine that I should have in here. But by the way, if it gets too late, we can repeat the demo later on. From time to time, too bad. Yes. Come on. Let's take this one and go here. I will repeat it later because I see people that is sorry for that. I will repeat it later. OK, so let's switch to the bad news. OK? So I basically have an Ubuntu machine here virtualized. And as you can see from the program CS, we have a really bad time because there is a boom method that is going to explode just because I am iterating a string using the less equal instead of less, OK? So the comparison exceeds the amount of integers that are there. And if I go running this application with .NET run, it will crash, of course, because that's the bad news. OK? That's, if you are lucky, most probably you just reading the message, you understand what is going on. But let's say that we are not that lucky, and I repeat the operation. And I want to give you an idea of what's going on. So you are in this situation where you go to the same machine and you make, and you are trying to understand where is your process. And OK. Oh. Yeah, but it's this one. I mean, 5846 is my number. The reason why it's broken because I pressed the backspace and you have control characters, but it does, never mind. And at this point, I have LLDB and the command line, which is a nice debugger, but it also have some problems in dealing with. The first news is that you have to use exactly the version which is compiled with .NET. Otherwise, you have a mismatch with the plugin that I'm going to load. And once you do that, you have these breaking things. Then I have to load a plugin that is used inside the runtime folder of .NET that is on USR, share, and then .NET, then shared again, then Microsoft blah, 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 then the 2.0 version. I have multiple versions installed here, and then libSOS plugin, SO. OK, I can load this stuff. And then I have to say, where are the other files? So I say, OK, set glr path. And OK, I have the path. At this point, I can enter SOS. And I have the commands that I gained with this plugin. That is a plugin that is make you life easier in order to understand the managed structure and memory and commands and so on. At this moment, I can continue the process that was breaked, OK? And at this time, I crash, OK? And once I crash the application, I finally have the break inside on the other side. I think that you will never do in production, but if it happens, you don't want to install too many things. And by the way, LLDB is very lightweight, and so you have a lot of things that you can do here. So the easiest way normally is to come on. Yeah, it was handled, of course. And break, process break. Ah. OK, that something went wrong with the set CLR path. So this is the reason why it didn't work. Let me redo the path. OK. .954 minus P. OK. No. And then I can finally make it let's see if I have the old one. 200. That should be fine. Load plugin. OK, plugin load is this one. And then I have the set CLR path. OK. Oh, it should work. Process continue. Resuming. Break. I have the break here. And then SOS, DSO. OK, we have. So if I have PE, I have basically the stack. OK? And you see that now we are inside, and I can print everything with the dump objects. I have the stacks, I have everything I need to debug the application and understand what's going on. It's low level, it's a bad news. I mean, it's not something that you enjoy. On the other room, I will give an idea of what's going on the nice Visual Studio debugging, but that's a good news because with these tools, you can really touch the ground and go there if it's really needed, okay? I'm sorry I'm a bit late, so there is more. I leave you this as a reference. That is basically the cheat sheet for SOS. That is the one that I was using before. These are the .NET Publish stuff. Even this I will show how my tool is working. That is extremely very powerful in order to deploy the application without getting crazy in using the SSH channel manually. And also, you will have a few other suggestions here in order to configure nginx to, as a reverse proxy so that you can receive the requests from an intermediate HTTP server. This is important because often you don't want to publish directly your server on the front end, but you want just to have load balancing and other cool stuff that nginx can do for you. And finally, this is another cheat sheet that I wanted to leave to you to run the process when the machine starts. So how it's a kind of startup, automatically start up for your application when you boot the machine, okay? And it is just a matter of a configuration file in this location and then running automatically the machine on Linux. If you have questions, please reach me by the other room, the one for the discussions. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for being late this time. Thank you.